Hey everybody, this is Blair, Jazz Fans Against Racism, and I wanted to talk about something that happened in my church this week. There was a video that was posted online of a BYU religion professor you might have seen. He's also a leader in the church. His name's Brad Wilcox, and it was of him making some racist remarks during a talk he delivered to youth in Alpine, Utah. And I want to start off by telling you more about my own background. I'm a member of the LDS Church. I'm a lifelong member. I am currently practicing, and I've researched LDS history and theology in university settings. I have a master's degree in religious studies, and I also worked at Brigham Young University for 8 years at a research institute that studied Mormonism and other faiths. And I loved many things about my time at BYU, but I didn't love other things about it. And so I decided after 8 years to find a new job, and I'm loving where I'm at now. But I'm saying all of this to point out that I have a pretty good background to talk about church stuff. And so I want to be clear about what my goal is. It's not to attack my church, and it's also not to deny or excuse racist things that have happened and that keep happening in it. I love my faith, and I'm also pained by my faith, and I want it to be better. So I'm going to lay out the history here so that people who aren't members of my church can understand what church members think about it or what the history is. But there's also a lot of church members that don't know much about the history, especially some of the uncomfortable or embarrassing parts. So I also should say why I'm talking about this with Jazz Fans Against Racism. And it's no secret that the church is a predominant part of Utah culture. And it's also no secret that racism has been part of its history. So I think it's important to address here. Up until 4 years before I was born, black men were restricted from being ordained to the priesthood in the church, and black women couldn't participate in temple ordinances, which is where Latter-day Saints are married, for example. So I never really had to think much about it when I was young, because I didn't know any black members in my local congregation. I was in Layton, Utah. I don't think I knew any black members in my junior high or high school when I was in seminary. Students typically take church seminary classes during school. So when I got called to Wisconsin on a mission, I was 19 years old, and I was kind of disappointed about it, but my first area was Milwaukee. And overall, that city is about 40% black, but the area that I was assigned to was probably about 90% black, maybe even more than that. And at the time, I didn't realize how racial discrimination in the United States had caused all this segregation. All I knew that I was one of the only white faces that I could see for weeks at a time, other than my companion there. And it's the first time that I realized I was a white person. It was also the first time that a black person looked me in the eyes and asked me why my church didn't allow black people to join until recently. And I was defensive about that. I was like, oh, that's not true, actually. Black people could always join my church. They just couldn't hold the priesthood, which, as you can guess, that wasn't a very persuasive response. But this guy, we were just on the street. He wasn't trying to call me out. I could tell he just really sincerely wanted to know, like, hey, like, what was up with that? Here you are talking to black people here in the inner city, what's going on? And I didn't have an answer for that. I couldn't remember ever having been taught an answer to that question that I could remember. So I started looking. I looked through church sources, and I found a bunch of older church talks and publications, and a lot of them had different reasons for the ban. And I was reading these, and it kind of seemed to take a little bit of the shame away, because it gave me some reasons to hold on to. They made it seem like this is something that God wanted, and that there were some good reasons for it, which we'll talk about in a second. So anyway, this week, a video went viral with a man called Brad Wilcox. He's a BYU religion professor, but he's also in the presidency over the entire church's young men's organization, so it's a pretty prominent leadership role. And he was talking to young people here in Alpine, Utah. And for part of his talk, he was raising questions that people would ask him. It was kind of a talk that was about people that were struggling with their faith or having questions about their faith. And so this is an example of a question, and he was acting like he was asking a question. And he says, I have the quote here, he says, "How come the blacks didn't get the priesthood until 1978? What's up with that, Brother Wilcox? What, Brigham Young was a jerk? Members of the church were prejudiced?" So that was the question that he laid out. And his tone was really sarcastic like that. And as though that was a dumb or bad question, or that it would be asked in bad faith. And then he responded to the question like this. He kind of tried to like flip it on its head or something. He says, but maybe we're asking the wrong question. Maybe instead of saying, why did the blacks have to wait until 1978? Maybe what we should be asking is, why did the whites and other races have to wait until 1829 to get the priesthood? 1,029 years they waited. Okay, that's the end of the quote. And there's a lot to unpack there. That's a lot of like insider speak. Like that's something that Mormons might pick up on, but people who aren't Mormon, it probably doesn't make any sense. So first, and I should say, first of all, by referring to people as the blacks, I think Wilcox was showing that he doesn't really know how to refer to black people in respectful or appropriate ways. So that's like, for starters, kind of an indicator that he lacks experience and understanding. But he's using church history as a way to avoid the question about black people in the priesthood. And so he says, why did white people have to wait 1,829 years? Okay, so the church was founded back in 1830, so 1,830 years ago. And church members believe that the founding of the church was a restoration of Christianity, including a restoration of the priesthood, which is like the power to direct the church and do like baptisms and stuff like that. And so the church teaches that there was this great apostasy after Jesus Christ and his original apostles died. So like Jesus was on the earth, he called 12 apostles, they baptized people, they were kind of creating a church. And that church then, when the apostles were killed or died, was basically scattered and lost, according to Latter-day Saints. But sort of counterfeit versions kind of persisted, like Christianity in a sense persisted, the Bible continued to be used, etc. And depending on what Mormon you ask, they might say that that whole time was just like the Dark Ages was a real waste. It was just like a bad time. And other Latter-day Saints will say that, no, there was actually some great things happening there. God still was inspiring people to eventually pave the way for the church to come back, stuff like that. But basically what Brad Wilcox is saying is, why was the priesthood gone from the time of Jesus up to 1829, kind of saying as though that's a bigger deal than black people having to wait until 1978, right? So, of course, singling out one race because of their race is already different than a whole-scale loss of priesthood, right? But Wilcox actually gets his own Mormon history wrong here, and I think this is important. The church was founded in the early 1800s, so we're talking during the time of slavery, right? And even though it was founded in New York in the North, its missionary efforts spread throughout the country and sometimes encountered slavers and people who were enslaved, and its founders were all white, so its connections to American racism have kind of been baked in from the very beginning. On the bright side, Latter-day Saint congregations have been racially integrated from the beginning, and the founder Joseph Smith himself even ordained some black men to the priesthood. This is on record. And but he also, though, forbid the baptism of slaves without consent of their masters, wasn't big on radical abolitionism or like radical ways of abolishing slavery. This was kind of a fairly common Christian position, sort of middle of the road. And Joseph Smith actually ended up running for president before he was killed, and he ran on an anti-slavery platform, which is pretty significant. Like that's great, but he still did have some racist views. He believed that black people, he didn't believe that they're inherently inferior. He believed that their circumstances and like oppression and racism, frankly, had damaged black people and had really stunted growth and prevented them from being as good as the white people, right? But he also believed that would mean they wouldn't be able to peaceably live together, and so he advocated for black relocation, like separate territories, sort of a segregation type situation. And there were other abolitionists, and I think Abraham Lincoln kind of thought this way, and others floated similar ideas. But I should say there were also abolitionists who wanted full-on equality, especially a lot of black abolitionists, obviously. So all that is to say, Joseph Smith had a mixed record on racism, but it's important that Wilcox didn't mention the fact that Joseph Smith ordained black men to the priesthood, which would be a big deal because Mormons really value Joseph Smith. He's the founding prophet. He carries a lot of weight. And I don't even think that crossed Brad Wilcox's mind because it hasn't been strongly emphasized within the church. Only in the recent couple of years has the institutional church really tried to recognize that history more. and is trying to take account of that. So Joseph Smith died young. He was assassinated. He was just a little bit older than me when he died, and his successor to lead the church then was Brigham Young. And by then there weren't a lot of black members, and the church had gone back and forth about how openly it wanted to oppose slavery or welcome black members, as I said. And Mormons had their own problems at the time with persecution and trouble with neighboring citizens. They weren't welcome in the United States. They were a minority religion that was seen as strange and dangerous and things like that. So there were incentives for Mormons to not stick out their necks for more vulnerable people, which sucks. I mean, I think that was wrong. I wish that the church had been at the forefront of these issues, but it does help me to understand a little bit why Mormons did what they did, that they were ultimately driven away from the United States into the Utah Territory. And by the way, some members today would say, well, that's why the church couldn't ordain black people to the priesthood, because of all that persecution. But that doesn't cut it, because Mormons also practice polygamy, as everybody knows, and that was not popular. That was a problem. So if the question was, God wanted the church to be safe or whatever, I mean, it just doesn't add up, especially because the church largely avoided the Civil War because it was out in the Utah Territory by then. And, they weren't there for the Civil War. Mormons, by and large, for the most part, didn't fight in the Civil War or deal with that at all. And some of them saw it as sort of retribution on a country that had driven them out, rather than thinking about, this is, an opportunity for slaves to be free, etc. Anyway, Mormons are driven out of the U.S. into the Utah Territory. America is expanding. It soon grabs Utah back in. And the question is now, is Utah going to be a slave territory? And during the 1850s, that was being debated by the Utah legislature, with Brigham Young acting as the governor. So the prophet, the president of the church, is also the governor of the territory. And that's when Brigham Young, in the legislative session, declared that black people couldn't hold the priesthood. That's when it started. And Brigham Young, as historians have now found out, church historians especially have found out, Brigham Young was worried about interracial marriage. He believed that was a sin. He believed that black people had been cursed, that they were descendants of biblical figures like Cain in the Bible, Adam and Eve's son Cain, who killed his brother and receives a mark. The Lord puts a mark on him. In the text itself, the mark is a protection so that other people won't kill Cain. But anyway, Mormons and a lot of Christians grabbed onto that, especially slave-holding Christians, grabbed onto that story and used it to justify the oppression of black people, right? So Brigham Young pointed to things like that. And because he was church president, he said, this is the way it is. He said, if no prophet said it before, I'm saying it today, black people cannot have the priesthood, right? And church members see a president of the church, a prophet of the church, as representing the will of God to them. But not everybody saw it that way. I mean, the church had a quorum of 12 apostles. These are high-ranking, basically right next to the president. And there was one of the apostles just openly opposed what Brigham Young was saying and said, this is wrong. Like, we can't do this. But obviously, he wasn't church president. He lost that battle. I think that's important because it shows that there were Mormon leaders back then who would publicly disagree with the church president, which we don't really see that today. So black men were barred from receiving the priesthood, and black women were barred from receiving temple rituals, including marriage. And that matters big time because in Mormonism, every man is supposed to get the priesthood, and women and men are all supposed to go to the temple and get married. This is what Mormons call being sealed. It's a ritual that's said to bind people together for time and all eternity, right? Eternal marriage is a Mormon belief. And Brigham Young was really worried about interracial marriage. And so preventing black men from the priesthood and women from going to the temple was a perfect way to prevent white people from wanting to marry black people, right? White people want to participate in these rituals and get these blessings, etc. Black people were welcome to join the church, to be baptized. There were a few black Latter-day Saints early on back then. Their stories are online. There's a lot of resources now. But as you can imagine, black people usually didn't join the church at that time. And the church didn't try hard to get black people to join the church. So even today, numbers are still really low. There are more black Africans and black people in other countries than there are here in the United States. African-American conversion rates are very low. So technically, it's true, the church wasn't segregated, but in other ways, it was very segregated in its access to its most prized blessings, basically. Over time, race-based restrictions like this became increasingly uncomfortable for some church members, right? Especially as black people began to convert to the church in other countries like Brazil. The church was building a temple in Brazil, and black members were contributing and paying tithes and helping to build this beautiful temple. And it's like, well, they can't go in and enjoy the blessings of it. Also, outside pressure existed. The civil rights movement was heating up. There were boycotts like NCAA boycotts, right, of BYU sports. Like, we're not playing BYU, etc. The church needs to needs to fix this problem. The church is being racist was sort of the pressure that was being put on them. And also the church needed to explain, with all this pressure, why black people were being treated differently. They couldn't say, well, it's because we're racist. Obviously, they didn't believe that it was because of racism, so they'd point to the curse of Cain, the curse of Ham, these biblical figures, etc., that were cursed and passed the curse down through their lineages. And those reasons, again, echoed longstanding Christian defenses of slavery. But Latter-day Saints also drew on their own, on our own unique doctrines to justify it. So we believe that there was a premortal life, that everybody was a child of God before they were born, and that we grew and learned and developed somewhat before coming to earth, right? And so some people said, oh, in that premortal life, black people made bad decisions, or were lazy, or were less valiant or whatever. And that resulted in their being assigned to black bodies on earth, basically, right? That they would be marked with this curse. And you'll notice that all these reasons, by the way, blame black people, right? They suggest that white people were just doing God's will and that black people did something wrong or somehow deserved this or whatever. Pressure mounted, though, and finally, inside the church and outside. And in 1978, the church president said that there was a revelation to lift that restriction, to change it. That was in 78. I was born in 82. That's 4 years later. And it wasn't an easy thing for the church to do, obviously, because you can imagine the church had for decades, more than 100 years, taught that black people couldn't have the priesthood. So it raised a lot of questions, like, were the prophets wrong? One prominent church leader, his name is Bruce R. McConkie, people still will quote him today, he previously declared black people will never get the priesthood until after death, right? But then he gave this talk where he said, I was wrong, and church leaders were wrong. We spoke with a limited understanding, he said. So he also said, forget everything we'd said about it before 1978, because the new policy, he said, was God's will. So church leaders were trying to turn that around. But with its history and with a belief that Latter-day Saint prophets represent God's will to the church, it wasn't really possible to fully forget, like McConkie wanted people to forget, especially when black people were still asking questions about why it used to be that way to begin with. And then people like me going on my mission and confronting it and being like, yeah, why did that exist? So, most church members assume that the decisions of church leaders are God's will. And that included those racist restrictions. So members still, even though the ban was lifted, still needed to explain why it took so long, 126 years or whatever. And so new theories started coming up, like they would say, black people weren't quite ready for the responsibility of the priesthood yet, so they had to become ready and then they could get it. Or, I mentioned earlier that like the church would have been too persecuted if it had been more accepting of black people, etc. If they, Brad Wilcox tried to just sidestep the whole question. It's kind of this rhetorical trick, as though the loss of the priesthood from the earth in the apostasy was a bigger deal. So don't worry about what happened to black people. It's, and I should say Wilcox apologized. He issued a written apology, but all he really said was that he had used an illustration that was offensive, and he was sorry about that. And he was sorry that he heard people. He said, I'll try to do better. I'll try to learn and do better. But he didn't take back the underlying point. And so let's talk about that. His entire framing was already wrong. He didn't correct any of that. He mentioned that white people had been waiting for 1,829 years, but white people didn't exist for that long. White people are an invention that was created in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. The category of whiteness was created by now white people to elevate themselves and justify oppression of black people and other people of color. Whiteness didn't exist. You don't find that concept for 1,800 years. It makes no sense to say that white people waited that long because whiteness didn't exist. All right. I already mentioned that black people did originally receive the priesthood too. So Wilcox was wrong about that. Wilcox was saying that he was basically trying to say members should just have faith in God's timing, right? Claiming that the ban was God's doing and just have faith that God wanted it that way. But again, we can see in the history, Brigham Young's the one who started. There's no written revelation about it. There's no, as we have for other things. And Brigham Young started this one drop policy as well. And this is really important. This is how they decided who could receive the priesthood or not. Just one drop of, quote, Negro blood would disqualify a person. Just one drop. So like one black ancestor. But today, advances in genetic science, if any of you have done DNA tests, show that that policy is complete fiction, has no basis in reality, because most, if not all, white people share common genes with African ancestors. It's likely that most, if not all, of the church's original members, including the leaders, should have been disqualified from holding the priesthood or going to and participating in the temple rituals, because they all had like one job. They all do. So the ban itself literally makes no sense. We are all related anyway. So dividing it up by skin color doesn't make sense. So Wilcox, what he's trying to do is appeal to some white audiences by placing them on a similar footing with black people, right? So white people, he's like, white people had to wait too. We had to wait for really long. So he's centralizing white experience to downplay black experience and ignores the fact that black people were originally ordained. And he bases all of it on outdated views about race and genes that don't even make sense. And fortunately, in 2014, the church published an official statement called Race in the Priesthood. You can find it on the church's official website. And it outlined a lot of this history, the ban's historical context. It directly debunked a lot of the racist justifications. It said the curse of Cain, the premortal stuff, all of that's wrong. And it directly condemned, quote, all racism past and present. That's what it says. But the important thing is this: the church in that statement denounced the racist explanations, but it didn't directly denounce the restrictions themselves. It also didn't say God did it, but it didn't say God didn't do it, right? So current leaders have officially adopted a position that we don't know why God restricted black people from being ordained or worshiping in temple ceremonies. So you see the difference there is it's still God doing it. So the problem is that leaves a really uncomfortable gap that people like Wilcox and others are going to keep trying to fill up. The question of why did God do that? So we're going to keep coming up with racist justifications. Or in Wilcox's case, he wasn't really justifying it as much as he was just obfuscating. He was just kind of, trying to say, oh, that doesn't matter. And I think church leadership, my leadership, is concerned that admitting a big mistake like that or an error would weaken the credibility of church leadership, right? And their own authority then. How could you trust a prophet, right? And so it's just like a slippery slope. But I think that attributing those racist restrictions to God is what weakens prophetic authority and makes it seem like we're putting our prejudices onto God. And, Wilcox was using the Bible to try to find precedent for the discrimination. He said, why did the Gentiles have to wait until after the Jews to receive the gospel? So this is in the New Testament. Like, Jesus comes to the earth, he's a Jew, he's with Jews, and the gospel doesn't go to the Gentiles, the non-Jews, until after. But the New Testament's more complicated than that. Jesus taught non-Jews, and there were cultural reasons why that was happening. And it's also different than giving something to a people and then taking it away because of their skin color. It's not the same thing. He also brought up a Hebrew Bible example, so the Old Testament. He said, why did only the tribe of Levi, so there were 12 tribes, why did only the tribe of Levi have the priesthood during this time? But that's not accurate either, because the tribe of Levi had particular priesthood responsibilities. They were in the temple doing sacrifices, stuff like that. But there were other priesthood offices, like according to Mormon understanding, there were prophets and others that weren't in the tribe of Levi. So the priesthood was never just restricted to the Levites. And we also see in the New Testament, Jesus, he's trying to get the apostles to take it to the Gentiles, and they're the ones resisting it. He says, after he's died and resurrected, he says, take this to the ends of the earth. And they're not doing it. They're still kind of keeping it in-house. So in Acts chapter 10, after Jesus has died and resurrected and left and the apostles are doing their thing, the church leader, Peter, is wrestling about this issue. Like, are we supposed to take this to Gentiles? And it almost seems like he doesn't want to. But he gets this dream, this vision that kind of shows him, like, no, take it to everybody. But again, Jesus had already kind of told them that. So we're seeing church leaders are the ones that are kind of standing in the way of that. It's in the Bible. So when the church was restored, according to Mormon belief, when that church was restored, everyone was eligible. So we can't compare black people being barred from something that was originally given them to the Christian message rolling out in a particular way. It's not the same thing. It's just not the same thing. And again, with the Levites, it's not the same thing. All of these are kind of these like divine timetable apologetics, these defenses that are like, it's God's timetable, that God directed. He apparently these other discriminatory things, so he must have done this one. But as I just explained, those it's not the same comparison. The priesthood restrictions were textbook racism, dictionary definition racism, discrimination that negatively impacted people based on race. They were racist. It was a racist policy. And as a church member, as a practicing church member, I believe that God doesn't direct every single thing the church does. I believe that my church leaders are imperfect. I believe they have agency. I believe they make mistakes. I believe God works with a lot of different religious traditions. And within ours, leaders are not perfect. They're just like all of us in that way. We all make mistakes, right? We see in the Bible where leaders held prejudiced views. So Wilcox's apology leaves in place, it does not deny the claim that God directed the racist restrictions. And I think Wilcox believes God did direct them, but even if he didn't, he's a church leader, so he couldn't publicly say so. That doesn't go over well, right? But you know who can say they disagree? I can. I'm just a regular old member. And other members who are watching this, they can disagree too. It is okay to disagree with that. And when it comes up in church meetings or other discussions with family and friends, then my anti-racist efforts include saying that and speaking from my heart about it, for my own faith, about how I want my own faith to be better. If you're a Latter-day Saint watching this, I hope you will too. If you're not a Latter-day Saint, I hope this gives you some insight into where Latter-day Saint people here in Utah are coming from and like kind of what the history is. And speaking up like this as a member, it's not always going to be easy, and it can have risks. You might get ostracized, or people might think you're, being anti-Mormon, or you might not get called to certain callings and service in the church or whatever. But to me, the greater risk is that our silence about it is breathing life into ongoing racism. It's hurting current black church members. It hurts our own integrity. There are real-world repercussions for these racist attitudes. Like just a few weeks ago in Alpine, the same place where Brad Wilcox spoke, there was a young man on a bus that was being harassed with racist taunts. So imagine if Brad Wilcox had gone to Alpine and addressed that circumstance with the youth. He has reason to. The current president of the church, Russell M. Nelson, directly called on members to lead out. He said, lead out in abandoning attitudes and actions of prejudice. That's one of the things that inspired me to start Jazz Fans Against Racism to begin with. And I'm glad my church has officially rejected a lot of these racist justifications for race-based restrictions, but more justifications are going to come because we still have people saying that it was God's will. We need our leaders to disclaim these restrictions themselves. We need them to confront that racism more pointedly and consistently. We need to say, this was a racist thing. We're sorry. Speaking from within the church, we have all the resources we need to do that. The Book of Mormon is a story that's in part about racism. And one of the prophets in that book says directly, this book contains the mistakes of men. That's what the Book of Mormon says, that there's mistakes in there and that we'll see some of their faults. And he says, I hope you don't throw this book away because of our faults. In fact, I hope that you'll give thanks to God and be glad that you can see our faults because you can do better than we did. You can be more wise than we were. So we're invited to do this. The scripture invites us to do this. So I'm not going to sit in a church meeting and hear some racist remark and not say anything when I hear that at church, whether I say something in that meeting or I say something after or whatever. I hope that you'll do the same thing if you're a Latter-day Saint. I hope that you'll learn more of this history that I've laid out here. There's a ton more. I know I've gone on for like a half hour, but it's like this is scratching the surface. And there's a book, you can read a book called Religion of a Different Color by Paul Reeve. It's a great history of Latter-day Saints stuff on this. You can look up Centuries of Black Latter-day Saints. What is it? There's a project through the University of Utah that's looking at black people in Utah. You can also look for Black Latter-day Saints on Twitter, Instagram, Sistas in Zion, the Beyond the Block LDS podcast. There are a bunch of others, but listen to what Black Latter-day Saints have to say, especially if you're a Latter-day Saint. I could say a lot more. A half hour is pretty long. What I want to say, just to sum up, is we have a racist history in this church. It still has repercussions today. We're still experiencing it. It hasn't gone away. I think there are some things that are improving. The church has partnered with the NAACP on a wonderful genealogy initiative of helping Black people trace their roots, and is sponsoring scholarships to Black colleges for minority students, just like the Jazz have their scholarship program. So the church is taking steps, but behind all those steps, we still have this problem of needing to confront the racist policy itself and saying, like, this was wrong. It was wrong. It was racist. That will make a huge difference when we can do that. I know there's a lot of Black members that are waiting for that day. That should be the long promised day that we're all waiting for. So learn the history. If you're not a Latter-day Saint, there's some stuff in here I said that you're probably like, oh, just forget the whole thing. I understand that impulse as well. My anti-racist seeds were sown in the soil of my Mormonism. It's like, it's kind of, I see wonderful things in my tradition and things that I'm ashamed of and that I wish never happened. And that's religion to me. I don't need to, if you have questions, go ahead and reach out. I'm happy to talk about it. But I think I've said enough. Thank you for watching all of this. It's a half hour long. I thought it would be maybe like 10 minutes, so sorry about that. But yeah, send me any questions you have about it. Let's talk more about this stuff. And I don't know if you can tell, but I went to the game last night, and I'm losing my voice because there were so many Warriors fans there, and we were like trying to drown them out. So that's fun. Oh yeah, and our merch is available. We're raising money for the Utah Black History Museum. Check it out. And thanks for watching this. All right, I'm just gonna figure out how to stop my video here.